clearly, he will challenge me on my knowledge of music because he recognized it.
I recognize that, McDonald, absolutely.
And that voice you're hearing is that of Dr. Terrence Farrell, as the aforementioned chairman of the Economic Development Advisory Board, and he's also the chairman of the cabinet-appointed State Enterprise Review Committee. He was, as you know, a former deputy governor of the central bank. Thank you so much for being with us this morning, sir.
Very welcome, Rennie.
There are a lot of issues being discussed. I want to take the time this morning to get you to clarify to us this thing called the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. There is still confusion in the public arena as to what this is. Make clear, please, when it was established and what was the intent of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund.
Okay, well, in 1998, the government then established what was called an interim revenue stabilization fund. And as that name suggests, its intention was that given the fact that when oil and gas prices are rising, the country experiences a significant increase in revenues. What you want to try to do is, because you know that oil and gas prices tend to follow a cycle, and in the case of commodities, that cycle tends to be long. So you could have 10 years of rising prices, and then you have 5 or 6 or 7 years of very low prices. That what you try to do is that you try to smooth out your expenditures. And in order to do that, what you then try to do is that when prices are rising, you take some of the revenue and you park it essentially into a fund. And then when prices fall, and therefore your revenues fall, in order to prevent your expenditures from declining drastically, you then use from that fund in order to be able to sustain your expenditure in a smooth kind of fashion. So the Pandey administration in 1998 established an interim stabilization fund. Now, just one thing I want to say about that is that we were late to that game. One of the things that I pointed out is that a country like Norway, which came into the oil business in the 1970s, established its fund long before we did. And Norway's fund is now of the order of over $800 billion US.
So it is a Norway template that we took, albeit late.
Well, no, there are other countries that have done similar kind of funds as well. In fact, they know not only commodity producers, many commodity producers have done it, but there are other countries like Singapore, for example, has over a period of time created its own what is called a sovereign wealth fund. Our fund is intended to stabilize revenues so that you can, in fact, stabilize expenditures over the period of time. Now, that was an interim fund. In the Manning administration, when it came in around 2005, decided that it needed to formalize that. That was an informal arrangement. It wasn't legislated under the Pandey administration. So the Manning administration decided to legislate it, which was a very good idea. The mistake was, and I repeat, there was a mistake in my view, that they combined the heritage and the stabilization funds into one fund.
One is taking a savings account and putting it together with a checking account.
That is a very good way of putting it, Rennie, actually. That is a very good way of putting it. The heritage fund, or component of the fund, has a completely different objective. It is not about stabilization. The Heritage Fund recognizes that your oil and gas resources are a depleting or a wasting asset. When I take my oil and gas out of the ground and I monetize it, it is not only for this generation. It is for our children, and it is for our children's children. That is what heritage means. Yes. Heritage doesn't mean carnival and scarlet ibis and those things, right? Heritage means that it is for the long-term development of the country, recognizing the fact that at some point in time, Trinidad and Tobago will no longer have oil and gas which it can monetize. The mistake was, and I repeat, in 2007, when the legislation was done, it was combined as a single fund. And all of the conversation that we are having now has to do with that confusion. What troubles me is that at the time that the legislation was being done, the government then was told that you should have two funds.
Yes.
The Vision 2020 subcommittee, which I chaired, macroeconomic subcommittee, was very clear, and we wrote it. We said that the government needed to have two separate funds. They did not heed that advice. They had one. They said they would do it down the road, and to their credit, there was a review period put into the legislation. But here we are, 10 years later, we are down the road. We are precisely at the point where we have now seen a significant fall in our revenues, and we have all of this confusion and all of this angst about taking money out of the heritage and stabilization.
The voice you're hearing is that of Dr. Terrence Farrell, Chairman of the Economic Development Advisory Board. We are talking about the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Two distinctly different purposes being served by a fund that is united. Now, that was recognized by your body. You said you made the recommendation. That was also recognized by the Minister of Finance when the new government came into power.
Right.
The as I remember, one of the earliest statements made is that we have to separate these funds.
Yes.
What has been the obstacle to now? Why has that not been done? And I am asking you that because we are coming along the lines of what is the confusion in the public arena. There was recognition by your body of professionals.
Yes.
There was recognition by the current government. The finance minister said, yes, this is what we must do early.
Yes.
Tell me, what is the obstacle? What was the hurdle? What stopped that?
Well, I don't think it stopped it. I just want to point out that, in fact, since the Prime Minister announced in December that, in fact, a drawdown from the Heritage and Civilization Fund was going to be done this fiscal year.
I'm sorry, you may have to repeat that because people missed it a long time ago. So maybe you have to mention again that it was mentioned way back then that this is what we are going to do. I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's another strange thing about our society, actually, Rennie. But here we are. So the Prime Minister did say it. He actually said the amounts that were likely to be used and so on. And since that time, the Economic Development Advisory Board, taking that point on board, has since sent to the Prime Minister a note. We don't disclose the contents of our notes because that's the protocol that we have. But essentially what we said is, look, the legislation that we have on the books now for the Heritage and Civilization Fund does not speak to the heritage component at all. It does not. Because remember the history. The history was that it was a revenue stabilization fund. The heritage component was added, and the only thing that was done in the legislation that speaks in a kind of a way to the heritage component was that a floor was put in the legislation. It said that you could take money out of the HSF, except that the floor was $1 billion US. And so therefore that billion was intended to be sort of like the heritage component. But the legislation that we have on the books now doesn't talk about the question of how money gets into a heritage fund, and importantly as well, how money can be taken out of a heritage fund. Because it's also important to understand that if I have a checking account, I will write checks on my account.
Right.
But if I have a savings account, I can also take money out of the savings account. So the heritage fund itself, money can come out of it. This legislation that we have does not speak to that at all. What are the circumstances in which money should go into it, and what are the circumstances in which money should be withdrawn from it? And the point that we would make is that those two things for stabilization, revenue stabilization, and heritage are different, and that therefore we should have different rules for money going into and coming out of a heritage fund from money going into and coming out of a stabilization fund.
Does raise the question, Dr. Farrell, if now that we are talking about doing the proper thing, you said it was a mistake. We all knew, we told them, they understood, the current government understood it was a mistake. Now you're going to separate the heritage, which is long-term money for our children, and the stabilization fund for when you're in trouble, like it's raining and it's pouring right now, just to be very clear. If you're going to do that, what percentage is now looked at as going towards the stabilization aspect, and how much will be left in the heritage fund? I mean, you're looking at separating them now.
Yes.
That is going to be the question, is it not?
It is, indeed. And I think that there is a little bit of guidance. The board of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, in its report on the fund, I think it's the 2014 report, recommended that they recommended the legislation not be changed actually, but they recommended that the floor, which is notionally the heritage component, should be raised to $4 billion. There was an amendment that was to the HSF that was put to Parliament in 2014. It was never actually done. And that recommendation in that amendment was for $3.5 billion to be the floor. So clearly, the thinking was on the part of the board of the HSF and presumably Parliament, that amount should be somewhere in the region of $3.5 to $4 billion.
How much do we know is in that fund right
It
now?
is about 5.7. Well, of course, we just took out a little bit.
5.7. So let's say, yes, 5.7.
Yes.
And as far as the earlier proposal was, we should move it to 4 billion. Then we say, okay, let's try 3.5. Now, what we have heard reported is that 2.5 has been pulled down with 2.1, is it?
No. That's 2.5 TT. Not US dollars.
Right, so not
That's
even
right.
close, all right?
Not even close.
What is the benchmark?
Yes.
What is the benchmark on the books legally that sets the level at which the government can dip into the fund? It is fine to say it is there for a rainy day, but there must be something to make clear what is a rainy day.
Yes, that's right. So the legislation currently, and we're just talking about the stabilization component of the fund, the legislation says if my petroleum revenues, and there is a definition of petroleum revenues which needs to be looked at, if my petroleum revenues fall by more than 10% of what I have budgeted in that year, that is the trigger. That says at that point in time, I can, in fact, look at using the fund.
Let me see if I understand this. You say if there is a shortfall of revenue in the energy oil sector of 10%, I am allowed to go into that fund.
I can.
All right.
Yeah.
By the way, just for my little pedestrian knowledge of economics, what percentage have we had a shortfall in our revenue? I'm just curious.
In the case of petroleum revenues, petroleum revenues here are normally, in the last couple of years, have been running about 18 to 20 billion TT dollars. I think that this year the Minister of Finance indicated that he expects somewhere like about $4 or $5 billion. It's been a steep drop.
So when I said we're not looking at something that's set up for a rainy day, we did not use it at rain. We used it when it started pouring and the galvanizer was not holding the water out. Because at that kind of great shortfall, you have all the reason in the world to go into the, let me say it slowly, to go into the stabilization fund to stabilize an unstable economy. Am I correct?
Yes, but it's more like a hurricane. It's not just
But
raining.
thank you very much. Yes, this is hurricane time we're talking about, and it's important to say that. And I'm not even attempting to make light of it. My incredulity is fueled by what seems to be an amazed reaction from many. You are going into the fund. Why are you going into the fund? What is the prereq? What is the justification for going into the fund? Somebody said, I need transparency. In other words, it sounds to me like they're saying, I need every item itemized before you go into the fund.
Yes. Well, that is another aspect of the recent debate, which reflects, again, I think, a lack of understanding of government finances. So people have been saying transparency. The minister must tell us what he is going to use the money for. But you see, the trouble is that the minister has already told the country what he's going to use the money for, because he brought down a budget in October of this year where the estimates of expenditure for the year laid out what the government intends to spend the money on.